Hi, I'm Red Rose.
And I'm Blue Rose.
This is Rose Playing Games, where we're both named Rose, and we like talking about tabletop role-playing games. So today we're here to talk about comedy in tabletop role-playing games, right? As you might have noticed, people often laugh a lot while playing D&D, other RPGs. Like, it's often really funny. That's one of the most prominent things that comes up when you like watch an actual play. Is often it's really funny, but most games don't like try to be comedic, right? There's no like someone punching up the D&D script, right? So it's sort of like, oh, how do we get to this place where these games are so frequently funny, right? Even though that's not really part of the explicit design, right? I know. What are your thoughts?
Well, I mean, like there are sometimes attempts like there are like joke monsters like the flump that sort of thing. But like it's the most games don't even have those, and they don't really require them to be funny.
Yeah, I think sometimes games that are comedy games, well, they can be funny. They're not always, certainly, right? And they're not necessarily funnier than games that are not designed that way, right? And I'll get into why I think that is, right? But let's start with D&D, right? So you imagine your classic party of four. You got your cleric, you got a wizard, you got a fighter, you got a rogue, right? And then it's like, okay.
The OSR will take issue with the inclusion of the rogue, but go on.
You know what? I think the rogue is classic enough. Certainly at this point.
I don't mind.
What, do you want me to add an extra fighter instead? Oh, yeah, that would certainly... Anyway. Whatever, the OSR. And so getting into it, it's like, okay, so, like, if I tell you about this party, like, who do you think is the sort of jokey trickster?
It would be the rogue.
Okay, who's the nerd?
The wizard.
Okay, and who's the person who has a stick up their butt?
I mean, usually the cleric.
Yeah, the paladin if you have that instead.
If you have a paladin.
Right? And the fighter is kind of like the blank slate, right? Or sometimes the dumb guy, right? The dumb person, right? Especially if you was a barbarian instead, right? Just a sort of different version of fighter. That's very often the like dumb, unexpectedly violent is kind of like where the humor of that character comes from. And when you look at that, you see that it's kind of like very similar to the tropes and archetypes that we see in like sitcoms, right? That like you have these sort of stable of like trope characters who are often in kind of like opposing relationships to each other, right? Where like, oh, you have a clever character interacting with a dumb character, which gives lots of opportunities for like the dumb character to be dumb by comparison and then to be made fun of, right? And for, to make the clever person look more clever, right? And obviously the nerdy character kind of also stands out against the dumb character, right? But also stands out against maybe the suave or like sophisticated, right, clever, rogue, right? Right, as being kind of like oblivious, right, or awkward, right? And so I think those character tropes are actually a big part of what makes those games funny, right? It's just all the time you're kind of encouraged to really lean into these like exaggerated tropey versions of people, right? And really kind of play it out. And then I think the other big ingredient is that sort of like in the moment improv nature, right? That because everything's just you're figuring it out on the fly, right? It's not like you're writing a show to be funny to other people, right?
Although, I mean, that is kind of a classic style improv comedy, doing like you do it like a whose line is it anyway kind of thing.
Yeah, right? But it's more that like, oh, you're trying to make basically a comedy for the people at the table, a comedy for the people who are in it, right? To think that it's funny, right? And that's a kind of a different challenge than, performing for an audience.
Right.
Right?
Well, I mean, that's kind of role-playing games. You're kind of telling a story, but it's for the people who are in it.
Yeah, and there's lots of things that will be funny to that group of people that likely would not be funny to an outside audience, right? So, like, things like someone at the table really being themselves, but in a way that's kind of out of character from how most people are, right? You're like, oh, so-and-so is always like that.
Right.
Right? And then as well, right, things like unexpected failure, right? Lots of nat ones, often very funny, right? And this sort of like having to scramble and deal with that.
I mean, honestly, nat 20s can also be funny.
Yeah, the swinginess of the die.
Right. If it's like something like it's like you failed at something that there was an old like D&D comedy movie in which they did a bit about how like everyone trying to do a strength check to lift something, and then like the barbarian fails because he rolls a 1, and then like the weakest guy on the team like rolls high and lifts it even though he's like some little nerd.
Yeah, right? That people, it gives, because there's all this random chance, you're kind of pointing out it gives the opportunity for like really unexpected results for people to play against characters sometimes. Someone was writing that show, they'd never be like, the weak little nerdy guy lifts the thing, because it wouldn't make any sense and we wouldn't buy it.
Right, and even in that context, it was kind of a meta joke. Like, it only worked because of that context.
Right? It only works because it's sort of like, it subverts our expectations of what should happen, right? And this is a big part of humor, of course, is that there's basically, like, there's the thing happening, and then there's the second imagined thing that should be happening but isn't, right? And this is part of the reason why, like, old humor is, like, so bad, right? Like, if you try to read jokes from, like, you know, a couple decades ago, they're okay. A century ago, maybe they're fine. You try to read 300-year-old jokes, and they're completely nothing, right? They just don't make any sense at all, right?
I don't know if I entirely agree with that.
There's some exceptions.
I've read some old jokes that were funny.
But, like, for example, let's say you're, like, reading a Shakespeare play, and there's, like, a clown character. 90% of what they say is not funny at all. Right?
There's definitely a lot of context. There's not only is there context where it's like, oh, that was a joke about this political figure of the time, but there's also like the way what ways things are phrased.
Yeah, the way things are phrased, the physical actions.
Right, is a big part of what makes something funny, and because like language subtly changes over time, it can not necessarily land the same way.
Yeah. Right. And so you've got the thing that's happening, right? And it's always being contrasted against this sort of ideal of what should be happening. And, obviously the joke is in the contrast. And I think D&D is really good at sort of creating that contrast, right? That we have a pretty clear idea from our exposure to like fantasy media and heroic media and this, like, here's what should happen, right? And so, but then often the game does not deliver that. Right? I think a great example of that is like how funny it can be to have a greedy character in a game, right? That even though that's a trope that's sometimes played up somewhat in media, right? They almost always have like some sort of redemption arc or they come around to a heroic side. But having a character who's just straight up greedy in a game is often very funny, right? Because they're often really playing against a lot of the expectations of where the story should go.
Even though, like, that's actually a kind of a default expectation in D&D.
Yeah.
You're looting, like, that's kind of the core game.
And I think that's part of what makes D&D funny, is that we sort of, you imagine it's going to be Lord of the Rings, and then it's just, like, a couple of dirty people grave robbing, right? Like, the contrast between the sort of, like, the set dressing, right, and what you actually end up doing is just frequently enormous, right?
Well, okay, to be fair, I think that's because a lot of D&D was actually patterned a lot on like pulp fantasy, like Conan the Barbarian, in which straight up will just do that sort of thing.
Okay, but
and then people expect it to be Lord of the Rings.
But even if you compare it to Conan, right? It's like, how often does Conan spend 20 minutes trying to solve a puzzle, get frustrated, hit the wall a bunch, accomplish nothing, and then have to walk away?
Not a whole lot.
Right? Like, there's a farcical nature to it, right? And that it's not predetermined, right? You're just trying to figure it out. You're experiencing failure all the time, right? And I think that sort of like in the momentness is a lot of where the jokes come from. But I noticed that a lot of the sort of explicit comedy games don't really lean into character comedy. Right, they're not about like this contrast between characters. They're often more slapsticky, right? I'm thinking of like Honey Bear Heist, Paranoia, right? I think Fiasco to some extent. That one's a little more character comedy, but it's still,
yeah.
It's still sort of like, oh no, bad things happen, right? Which is kind of, I guess a lot of those are meant to be one-shots, right? Where it makes more sense. But it's kind of interesting that there's not actually that many games that are comedy games that are meant to be played long form. Right, and that lean into this more like sitcom-y verbal humor, even though that's the main thing you're doing, right? When you're playing D&D, you're not getting up and hitting people around the room and running around and doing silly antics most of the time. You're sitting there describing things, talking, bantering.
There actually was, I'm blanking on the name. There was, I think it was basically like kind of a source book for Paranoia, but it was kind of actually its own game. The High Programmers, I think that's what it was called.
Oh, interesting. Tell me about this.
Okay, so in the, if you're not familiar with Paranoia's thing is that you're all like in this sort of vault bunker complex, and everything is ruled by this AI that tells you to do contradictory things. It's almost like a parody of the idea of the GM role as a tyrant.
Right. What is it called? Like Great Computer or like Good Computer or something?
Friend Computer.
Friend Computer. Much funnier than everything I said.
Friend Computer, much funnier.
Friend Computer is genuinely funny.
There's actually a lot of funny stuff in Paranoia, and the game actually gives you different modes where you can. It tells like, do you want to play it straight or you want to lean into? I think it called it the Zap mode, where characters die a lot. But like,
I think in that mode you have like a set of 5 clones you start with.
I think it's 6. It's referred to as a 6-pack.
Oh, that's also pretty funny.
Yeah,
right. But it also runs pretty against the idea of character-based comedy.
Right. It's very slapstick. But there, so in the setting, there's supposed to be this idea that the high programmers, the people who are actually privy to and can alter the code of Friend Computer, have the most power of anyone besides Friend Computer itself. And so they made a kind of bonus extra game where you play the high programmers, and it's more like if a bunch of evil geniuses had regular roundtable discussions about how they were going to run the world. And so it's much more consistent about you're playing this really larger-than-life character that honestly just talks to other people a lot and, like, plots their demise and does evil vizier stuff.
Oh, I mean, that sounds really fun, right? And, like, kind of, leaning much more into that idea of, like, what are you actually doing at the table? You're talking. Where's the comedy coming from? It's the talking. Right? It's not from describing a physical action, right? Because that can often kind of be really hard and sometimes land flat.
Yeah, right? Some scenarios for hill folk lean into this a little bit, where they because that's also a game that's almost entirely about talking, and there had some like playset type scenarios.
Yeah, it's very much about like relationships between characters.
But some of like if you set it in a silly premise, then it can very easily trend that way.
Right. Oh, I just lost my train of thought. What was I going to say?
I'm sorry.
No, it's fine.
Giving too many examples.
I can't remember.
Personal comedy. Consistent character over
comedy.
Time, not slapstick.
Oh, I was going to talk about Monster Hearts, I think.
Ah, okay.
Right? So that's a game where you play teenagers in sort of like a paranormal dramedy kind of situation, right? Kind of like Buffy or like Twilight, obviously being an inspiration. That's another game I remember being really funny, right? Because it's really
not meant to be, really.
Yeah, but it often was. That's what I'm saying, is that the fact that you're teenagers and that we're all very familiar with teen dramas and the tropes of it, right, allows a lot more moments of humor because you're always able to sort of like measure what you're doing against the tropes, right? And be like, wait a minute, like, you know, you gotta lean into it, and sometimes that's funny, right? Like, oh, of course, you know, this girl's head over heels for a vampire who's constantly giving weird signals that he's controlling and bad, right? You know, or sometimes the opposite, right? Like leaning against it, like, you know, having a moment where like suddenly the characters just start bickering and fighting each other and then have a dice roll off for no reason, right? And it kind of results in nothing, right? You know, that, you know, I think that sort of encouragement to play characters who are maybe more, you know, in touch with their id, right, more like emotionally driven, right, I think does encourage comedy as well, right?
And like I guess a game that kind of leaned into that would I'm not gonna pronounce the name properly. It's like Pasión de las Pasiones.
Oh, is that the lesbian one? Or
no, it's a PBTA game about where you play like a telenovela.
Oh, okay, that sounds like a great comedy game.
Oh, no, I haven't played it. I've only read it, but it reads hilarious. I mean, it almost, because it really encourages you to lean into the tropes, like you start each session by, like, coming up with a last time on where you make stuff up and then like everyone is like these like really like one person plays twins or some other kind of really like soap opera tropey thing.
Yeah.
And then like you're very much encouraged to just lean into doing really melodramatic stuff. And it's very funny.
Yeah. And so I remember now the game I was trying to think of. It wasn't Monster Hearts. It was Yoseba's Bed and Breakfast.
Oh.
Right? That's a game that I think also often succeeds at being comedic, right? Because the characters are really exaggerated, larger than life in like a particular direction, right? There's like the very sad businessman is I think one of the best examples.
You liked the very sad.
I think he was called like Mr. Biggs or something.
I forget. It will come to me later.
It's not important. He was the sad businessman, right? I'm going to call him Mr. Briggs for now, right? And so he literally carries around a little umbrella that rains on him, right? Which is just like a little silly visual joke. But then all of his moves are about that. They're about raining on people's parade, correcting people with your umbrella. He's kind of like this one joke kind of elaborated into like a whole character. But it really brings out that like exaggerating in a direction you don't need to be playing like a zany or fun character for that to be good, right? That often playing into like really dark stuff is very funny, right? It's a pretty lighthearted game. You're probably not going to play him as like actively suicidal, but you might, right? You could certainly play him as very dour and pessimistic, right? And Mark Rosewater sort of talks about this, about sort of like pushing it, right? He was writing, and Mark Rosewater is a magic designer. He was talking about, he sort of learned from this experience of writing a play where one of the characters was depression, right? And, he's sort of like, I shouldn't make depression too depressed. Like, that'll bum everyone out. And so he gave them kind of lighthearted lines, and people sort of didn't like the character much. And then he's like, okay, he gave depression, like, just the saddest lines he could think of, right? Just, like, flat-toned hopelessness all the way through. And then people thought the character was hilarious. Right.
Yeah, I mean that it can be funny. Like there's a lot of comedy is taking like making things that are bad, but like as long as it's not too serious. It's like the premise of slapstick is like that someone gets hurt, but not that much. They don't get really injured. They're okay in the next scene. If someone actually ends up in the hospital, it's usually not funny. It can be.
That's where we get more into dark comedy.
Sure.
Something like The Death of Stalin.
Right. And like if anything, I would say there are actually a lot of role-playing games that lean a little bit into dark comedy.
Oh yeah,
like
absolutely.
Like Warhammer and its derivatives love dark comedy.
Is very funny.
Oh yeah, and right? A lot of it's supposed to be.
Yeah.
Especially by the time you get to like 40K, especially like earlier stuff, it to some extent moved a little bit further away from it over time, but there's a lot of satirical aspects.
Yeah.
And like it's supposed to be kind of silly how grimdark this is.
It's like incredibly grimdark. It's like you melt down all the people on a planet and turn them into drugs that you shoot into your eyeball. Right? Or like, and then also the silly combination of sci-fi and fantasy elements with like the space dwarves and giant ships shaped like hammers.
Yeah.
Right? And again, those are both like just taking a thing and just pushing it up to 11, right? Which is a certain, like, I think a great style of comedy and sort of central to comedy is this exaggerating, though it's interesting sometimes playing stuff that's a little more subdued, right? I'm like, I really kind of want to play Seinfeld, the tabletop role-playing game, because those characters are ridiculous. They are over the top, right? But they're definitely, like, just kind of doing regular people stuff.
I believe someone did write, it was basically like, Frasier, the role-playing game.
I would love to play that. I think that would be a lot of fun.
I'll see if I can find that later.
Yeah, but it's one of the problems you run into with these kind of exaggerated one-note characters is that after a little while, they stop surprising you, right? Because they do the same thing every time, right? And so it's sort of like this weird complex thing where you really want to play up to the character's traits, right? Of like, oh, the dumb character is dumb, but every once in a while, the dumb character has to do something smart, right? Or else you lose all the surprise.
Well, yeah, I mean, surprise is a big part of comedy.
Yeah. right? So, and the reason I'm thinking about this all is because I'm working on a game, right, that's supposed to be comedic. It's about you play a bunch of little homunculi in a dungeon. You're like trying to escape and using potions. And initially I was inspired a bit more by games like Goblin Quest, right, where you have like a group of like 5 goblins and they're totally disposable. And then like the more I thought about it, I was like, you know what? I don't think that might be okay for one session, but I think that would wear out pretty fast, right? I've played those D&D games where you're in a meat grinder and it's very easy to just check out, right? You stop caring, right? That without some investment in the characters, it's hard to sort of like laugh at their misfortunes, right? It's just sort of like, it's just like, oh, okay, right? It's all shock value humor, right? At a certain point, and it kind of like stops hitting, right? So that sort of really got me thinking about this topic a lot. Which I'm now realizing I did not have quite as much to say about it as I wanted to as previous times.
Fortunately, there is more to say. So, I was going to say, yeah. Right. The thing with about archetypes is, and I think we discussed this on a prior time, that almost the fact of the idea of classes is almost a good way to get people to act comedically, because it gives them a license to do something. Like because to some extent, because they didn't, like, if you just built a character out of like traits, it can almost be like, well, why did you pick that trait?
Yeah, why'd you take the moralistic asshole trait?
Yeah, whereas and you could say that's like sort of the same, where you was like, well, you chose to play the paladin, but there's kind of a license to play the paladin, and if you're a little bit uptight and kind of a jerk, it's fine, as long as it's not completely taken to it a really annoying extent. And that can letting people to play into bad things is a big part of what allows you to do comedy.
Yeah.
So having like established roles where it's understood in like this commedia dell'arte kind of way, that this character does this and this character does this, it makes that acceptable, and people are more willing to lean into it and roll with punches.
Yeah, and it encourages people to do more interesting role play, right? Because if you're just always doing like what's best in that situation, right, it's like, well, most people are just going to land on the same thing. There's not going to be a lot of intergroup conflict in a lot of situations, right? Whereas if you're coming to every single situation with like, here's my character, here's who they are, they have these couple of big, strong things about them, right? And those are often opposed at least a little bit to another group member, right? I think there's just so much comedy potential in those like pairs and oppositions, right? And yeah, I think classless systems often lose that, right? I think we were playing Cairn the other day, right? That was a game that had lots of zany elements, right? And we still had fun playing it. And
actually, it was very funny.
It was very funny, right? And the zany elements, like the potion of bees and stuff, right? But I felt like a lot of the comedy was very much coming from the situation and not from the characters.
Well, that's what I was going to say. Like another point, because there's characters, but honestly, this is, I think, what we were talking about, how like role-playing games have a tendency to end up funny. Just inherently, like you often end up getting in really kind of unusual situations, and then you're desperately trying to come up with lateral solutions to them. And a lot of that is like both the situations and especially the solutions can end up very funny.
Yeah.
Like even if you're basically playing it straight, people will end up laughing. And I think that's actually a strength, is that they can end up, things can end up so funny, even if the overall premise and like nothing in the rules is inherently funny.
And I think actually having rules that aren't funny then sometimes makes the funny moments funnier. So Delta Green, great example, right? So this is a game that on its surface is like pretty dark, right? It's eldritch horror. It's about like fighting a hopeless fight against the unknown forces threatening humanity. Frequently one of the funniest games I've played, right? Because you're rolling D100. So even when you're really good at something, you often have like at least a 1/5 chance of failing, right? So it's like even experts are just fucking up all the time, right? And you often can get failure cascades where like one fail into another, right? And so you've got these people who are supposed to be like these crack, like secret agents, right? Fighting the forces of darkness. And then they like, oh, I need to drive a car into like the metal guy. Oh, okay, you hit your friend instead, right? Like, turns out you're terrible at driving, right? there's like this contrast between like the narrative of the game and what the mechanics produce. The mechanics produce this sort of like sometimes slapsticky failure at points, right? Of just like, people just being inexplicably bad at stuff, right?
Right, which I think, if anything, you could like trying to tamp down on that is part of why some, especially more modern games, don't let you fail as much and make it so it's like, oh, well, you take a negative consequence, but you succeed. Just because it can make characters seem silly and incompetent.
It often does bring out the comedy in a game, right? And it's one thing I did notice about Yazebas, as much as we were like having a very fun time playing it, right, and fun time doing bits, you're less often surprised by your own character, right? You more often think of something that you think would be funny to the rest of the group, and then you describe it or do it, right? And it's sort of, you've got a little inspiration in front of you, right? But there's not as much of like that feeling of things like spiraling out of control.
Right.
Right? Like that almost never happens.
Yeah, random elements tend to do that. Like, because another game like that isn't inherently funny but can very easily be is Pendragon.
Oh, what makes Pendragon so funny?
Well, because Pendragon has a sort of unusual aspect where your characters, not only do they have stats like strength, but they have stats like that are kind of sliders between like how much temperance do they possess.
Okay, that's great.
Or humility and so on, and you'll have to roll to check with like, someone insults you, do you like immediately smack them and challenge them to a duel? And it's like, well, I don't want to do that as a player, but I'm going to roll. It's like, oh, my guy's really prideful. I guess I'm going for it. Or even like, or like indulging too much of a party. It's like, well, I guess there was a bunch of alcohol and I guess I couldn't resist.
Again, that's getting a bit more into that like permission to play to the flaws.
Yeah.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
That when you really set up a character with these flaws, right, you really give people permission to kind of like play it up, right? And be like, okay, I made a character with really low temperance. Guess what I'm going to end up doing a lot of, right? And no individual time am I sort of being like, oh, I made this decision and I'm derailing the game. It's like, no, this is just like a thing that happens, right? It's part of the experience, right? And sort of helps everyone get on board with it, right? And yeah, I think that's really something to think about when designing games, is trying to design in, if you want a game to be comedic, thinking about like, how do I make sure that characters have strong flaws, right? Flaws that are like interesting to play out, come up frequently, and often contrast with other players, right? Or other characters, right? I'm thinking of like Brooklyn Nine-Nine. There's like Captain Holtz, right? Who's like this absolutely just like by the book, sounds like a walking dictionary, like super rigid rule follower kind of guy, right? And so great foil for one of the main characters, Jake Peralta, who's like a wisecracking, like kind of jokester character, right? And so a lot of the funniest banter is between those two people because they have such strong contrast and contrasting flaws, right?
Which is why I think we discussed the idea of like, to some extent, almost maybe thinking about character creation in pairs.
Yeah, that's something I think there should be more of, right? You had an experience a little bit where you played, what was that OSR game called? The Worm something?
His Majesty the Worm. Yeah, I played this very incredibly like upright, like to a fault paladin type Templar, and got paired with this like kind of lascivious drunkard nun. Right. Who just constantly like just hey, and like, no, and then like she would get into trouble and I'd have to pull her out of a situation, but I was just constantly exasperated by her. But I couldn't let her go because she was my sister, and it was,
I think sibling relationships are often really funny.
It was a whole bit, but it was and it was very easy to pull comedy out of that.
And I think one of the things that makes sibling relationships funny is that neither person can suddenly stop being siblings with the other, right? People can break up friendships or romantic relationships, but if you stop having anything to do with your sibling, right, they're still your sibling, right? That relationship never really goes away. And often it's sort of implied quite strongly, in our society's values, that you should not distance yourself from family. And no matter what they're doing, you should put up with it, right? But it also allows for just kind of fun bickering, right? Because we expect that from siblings, right? Because it happens all the time, right? Yeah, so thinking about those pairs, right, and trying to make sure that it's not sort of just like 5 total strangers coming in.
Oh,
right?
no.
Sometimes that can work.
It can, but on average, it's better if characters know each other.
Yeah, and I feel like straight to like some of the comedic things is like make people siblings, make people dating. And I guess on that point, there's sort of like that elephant in the room of D&D comedy is the horny bard, right? This is like a very frequent joke to the point where it's tiresome and cliche, right? But I think it's also there for a reason, right? That we all kind of probably want to be a little more sexually forward than we actually are in our lives, right? And often D&D is a space where people get to experiment with that or sort of play a version of themselves that they aren't normally, right? Where they're like, yeah, I'm totally going to go hit on that person and walk up to them super confident.
Yeah, in the same way that a lot of other things, like the barbarian lets people act out anger in a way they wouldn't be allowed to in real life, where it's like, actually, I'm just going to go smash that thing.
Yeah, right? And that sort of like inappropriateness is also part of the humor, right? And it's also that sort of like expression of the self, right? I was reading this thing, I'm trying to remember his name. He's a sitcom writer, right? He's talking about like when he's writing a sitcom, he doesn't think of the characters as separate people. He thinks of them as basically parts of himself. He's like, okay, when I think of a clever line, goes to the clever character. When I think of something dumb I do, goes to the dumb character, right? You know, when I think of a desire or a lust, goes to that character, right? You know, that you're kind of dividing up the self into these exaggerated chunks, right? That then play off of each other. And I think that's kind of an interesting way to look at it, right? To be like, oh, like your character doesn't need to be like a fully developed person necessarily. They are, but in some ways they're more like a part of a person, right?
Yeah.
And then as well, you know, other comedy writing advice is often, you know, like write from your own flaws in particular and your own struggles, right? There's a game called, I think, Frog Detective, right?
I don't know this one.
It's a weird video game. You are a frog who is a detective, but there's kind of no crime to solve, right? You show up on an island and there's like a little bit of mystery, but then it kind of just goes nowhere. It's kind of the Seinfeld of a mystery game, you know? Right? Like you talk to someone who's very anxious and afraid of ghosts, and the fact that they haven't ever seen any ghosts is proof, of course, that there are ghosts because you can't see them, right? And all these sorts of things, right? And this person is like, oh yeah, that's from my own experience of anxiety, and I just kind of like, okay, why don't I dial that up to 11 and put it in this character, right? And I think it can be interesting as the GM when you have to play all these kind of like NPCs, thinking about like, okay, right, like what parts of myself can I kind of put in the world, right? You know, if I want to have a character for people to interact with, can I take some part of myself and just really turn it up to 11, right? Be like, oh, I'm sometimes a little nervous about like talking to people. Let's make a character who's like 100 times that, you know? Yeah, I don't know. What's your experience with sort of like comedy from the like side of someone running the game?
Well, I was going to say, like, in the way that we were talking about, having like the randomness of failing, or like roll, like the Pendragon thing about like rolling to see whether or not you are chased or something. It actually like that I think that goes the other way, where some of the funniest things I've had happen on the GMing side have been like random charts. Like I tried to roll up some Spark tables for something. It's like, that's odd. I'm not sure what that is, and you try to justify it somehow. Or like random encounters.
Random encounters can often be pretty funny.
That guy, okay, that thing showed up. Like, that thing showed up 3 times in a row. What is its deal?
Yeah. Right? And I think the thing that often makes me laugh the most as someone running the game is when I have some chaotic players at the table, right? Because then they surprise me, right, with their actions, and they surprise me in a way that forces me to scramble and figure it out, right? When people like suddenly just kill off an NPC for no reason, right? And you're like, okay, we weren't planning for that. Now what happens?
Suddenness can also is often often funny.
Yeah.
This is not like an actually once again, this isn't a comedy game, but there was a game called I don't speak Norwegian, so I'm not gonna pronounce it right, but Itrisby.
I think I've heard of this.
It's
one.
a surrealist game that's set in this sort of like 1920s town of just strange things. It's a very good game, and I recommend reading it. The rules are actually pretty simple, but it has this mechanic of where there's the deck of chance cards, and everyone gets to draw a chance card and they get to hold it and they can play it to have the effect happen. And the effects are just something suddenly happens, like suddenly a meteor falls from the sky. But that's not actually one. Actually, okay, good example. There's one that is when you play it, the scene smash cuts forward to some time after the current events, where all of the main characters are okay, and then they have to then explain, so how did you get out of that situation?
Yeah, right.
How are you all
kind of
dead?
jump forward to do a flashback, right? Playing with time is something that you can really do a lot in a role-playing game, where you can just kind of like cut a scene where it's funny and move on to the next thing, right?
And it also lets you inject like sudden, absurdly good or absurdly bad luck or anything like that. So I don't know. I thought it was a pretty neat mechanic, which would lend itself to comedy.
Yeah, it's interesting though, because coming back to that, like the contrast between like the groundedness and the absurdity, right? I feel like sometimes when things get too far into the absurdity, they kind of lose me.
It's true,
right? Because
There's
I'm like,
balance.
oh, nothing makes sense anymore, right? I expect for things to not make sense, right? So I'm less surprised when they don't, right? And it's harder to care about a world where you feel like the rules don't exist.
True.
Right? I would still probably find that like interesting, but I think it'd be kind of actually tough to run, right? Because you'd have to be like, okay, how do I convince players that there's a shared reality they're in?
Well,
right?
in that game, there isn't really.
Yeah,
I think it's pretty accepting of the idea that something might not make sense. So it works within that particular context.
I think often the funniest stuff, like in board games, for example, is actually often games that have really mundane themes, right? Where you're just like, Suburbia is a great example, right? You're just building some suburbs, right? You're just taking little hex tiles of like some housing complexes and things. But all the time you'll just be like, oh, actually I can like just put the garbage dump next to the old folks' home and score a bunch of points because of this weird special modifier I have. And then let's turn that into a lake and right, like, because it's stuff that's really familiar and everyday, when then the game mechanics inevitably produce things that are not realistic because it's not a simulation of reality, right? That's often very funny, right? And there's like 101 webcomics that are basically just this joke over and over, right? Of you do a thing in a video game, you think about how that would work in real life. Wait a minute, that would be really weird.
Right.
Right? And I think that's part of where the like humor of games come from, and that you're like interacting with this like imperfect simulation, right? And because the simulation is imperfect, right, you get all these contrasts between like some parts of it making sense and working, right? And then some parts just completely falling apart.
The peasant railgun is funny.
Yeah, right? The peasant railgun is... Tell people what that is.
Okay, so this was a thing in 3.5 edition of D&D where the rule, because like a round takes about 6 seconds, but the rules for if you've readied an action to do something that just kind of happens immediately, but there's no upper limit on that because it would be too annoying to try to say, oh, well, you can never have more than 10 or something. So you can just have like someone say, well, I like if I make it so that if someone hands me an object, I hand it to the next guy over here. And then you just like, the idea is that you hire just 1,000 peasants to stand in a line and to hold a ball or something, and it's like ready to like pass it to the next person over, and they all pass, but it happens instantly, but it has to happen within 6 seconds, so you can just like break the speed of sound with it.
Yeah, right. So that's a great example of like where you start to push the simulation till it breaks, right? And then you kind of get this joy and comedy out of like breaking the fake reality you're in, right? To do something ridiculous. But if you didn't, that only kind of works because so many other parts of 3.5 work, right? They're simulationists, they have rules, they kind of correspond to our ideas as sort of what would be a realistic,
right,
even if it's like a little exaggerated or like heroic fantasy. Whereas if the whole time you could do all sorts of weird stuff like that, then the peasant railgun would not be very funny, right? It would just be like, oh yeah, okay, yeah, you do that.
Yeah. Yeah, like it's funnier to break GURPS, I would think, than many other games.
Oh, GURPS is so breakable.
Oh, it is.
Right? Though interestingly kind of lacking in that character-based humor, right? There, the humor is really about like breaking the game, right? That, I guess sometimes you have really exaggerated classes, but because it's this like a la carte system, right? There's not necessarily that sense of like the class comes with an identity.
Sure, not that it strictly needs to, because you can just make a character that's funny.
You can just make a character that's funny.
It's just like it's like leaning into archetypes is just a very like somewhat more reliable way, but it's not necessarily the best way. Like like if someone makes a character that is very specifically tuned to be funny and they're good at it, it's going to be even better.
Yeah. I just remember trying to run it when I was like a preteen or something and it being a disaster.
Oh, sure. Oh, it's right? hard because there's a lot.
I think, no, someone else was maybe trying to run it, and I think I made a character who like couldn't talk, who was basically just like a Yeti, right? And like couldn't do anything other than murder people, right? And that was... It's funny in concept. But
there are some funny things in GURPS just because of the extent to which, almost more than any other game I played, the game really incentivizes having characters who can't do a lot of things.
Yeah,
like
just completely min-maxed.
Yeah, it was like okay, well, I can get some more points if my character is missing an eye, and
yeah, right, and. That kind of, to me though, it's like a short-lived comedy, right? It's like this kind of comes up in like longer form improv, right? I definitely noticed this one time when I was like running a game with someone where every time there was a scene, they just immediately went to like the quickest cheap joke, right? And it was like some like cowboy western setting, and it just immediately made everything fall apart so quickly, and like the game just like disintegrated, right? Because there wasn't that sort of sense of like build up and release, right? It was just like we start to build up and, well, now the thing's happening, right? The next craziest thing this person could think of is happening, right? Whereas like in that longer form, you have to kind of wait out the sort of like some of the easy jokes to then like build up to something more interesting, right? Which can be kind of challenging, right? It can be kind of challenging to sort of like be like, oh, I'm going to do a bunch of things in a row that aren't necessarily funny, right? While I'm trying to be funny, right? In order to eventually get to something that's much funnier than anything I could have thought of in the moment.
There's actually within the last couple of years, a Monty Python and the Holy Grail RPG.
Oh, okay.
Official one, which is funny because that game was that movie was such a touchstone culturally for a lot of D&D.
Oh my god, like for D&D players, it's
not
like,
so much now, but
it's just like constant Monty Python quotes.
Oh, constant. That was just. Yeah, I mean, like it even made its way into the vernacular in some ways, like Tim's in Magic the Gathering.
Yeah. Right,
like that's just a Monty Python joke.
Yes,
the guy on the card looked kind of like a character from Monty Python.
Yeah, right. The Tim the sorcerer who throws fireballs, right? Which is in itself again a joke about like you don't expect a sorcerer to be named Tim,
right?
Right, and right, or like I think it's interesting. I think there's actually a reason for that because a lot of the jokes in Monty Python, right, have this sort of like combination of like medieval fantasy with absurdity that kind of actually matches the tone of Dungeons and Dragons, like the rabbit that suddenly murders everyone, right? Like all the time in D&D, you'll go to fight like some goblins who are not that tough, and then they'll like crit someone and kill them, right? And you're like, oh my god, they get killed by the goblin, right?
But the reason I bring that up is because although there are definitely there are a lot of very goofy elements in that game, one of the things the book actually recommends that you do not really intentionally try to be funny. That's almost too obvious. It'll come out too cheap. That if any like your characters are much like the characters in the movie are taking it seriously.
Yeah.
Like to them, they are in fact knights going on a heroic quest.
King Arthur, he's like doing the horse thing with the guy with the coconuts, but he's like dead serious the whole time.
Yeah, he doesn't think that's funny.
Right? He's never like laughing at there's some guys out behind me with coconuts. He's like, no, I am a regal king and people should bow down to me.
And like in comedy, like having actors suppressing their desire to crack a smile is like some of the difficult thing, because if they actually do just start laughing, that would deflate the scene usually.
Yeah, and it's one of the things that can actually... But it's actually kind of really different when you're playing a game with friends, right? Because you're kind of laughing as you go most of the time, right? And often that sense of laughter is very contagious, and there's this sense of things getting more and more out of control as people are trying to like gasp out their lines between laughs.
Right. But it's still different because like there's a separation between you, the person who's playing the game, and the character that you're playing.
Yes, the character is dead serious.
The character
you're
is
cracking
serious.
up, even though you're trying to act as the character.
And I think it's generally fine if players crack up. I don't really find that deflates things.
Yeah, until you get to the point where you can't do the
Sure.
thing. I've definitely gotten to the point where I'm laughing so hard at a joke I just thought of that I can't say the joke.
Yes, that does happen.
Right? And it's interesting because there's a context where you're kind of like, normally it's considered like if you're doing stand-up comedy, like it's kind of weird to laugh at your own joke, right? But people do that in tabletop role-playing games all the time. Right? They say a joke and laugh at their own joke.
Well, because, I mean, like, it isn't weird just... Because it's more casual. In a casual context, when you're just having a conversation with someone, you laugh at your own jokes. Everyone joins in and laughs. That's contagious. It's only in the more, like, artificial context of
performance.
Doing a stand-up routine. Not artificial bad, just it is a performance where you're trying to deliver it in a very particular way that you're not really supposed to laugh with it. Usually.
Yeah. Right. And so, right. I think that's like a little bit of sort of my thoughts around comedy and tabletop role-playing games is basically it's very present almost all the time, but it's rarely explicitly designed for, right? Like the Monty Python game is kind of an exception, and that actually talks about like, hey, here's how to be funny at the table, right? Like I've so rarely, like I've seen so much role-playing advice, right? And it's almost never like, hey, here's how comedy works, right? Even though improv comedy has obviously got a very close relationship with it. I mean, people do talk about the yes ending a lot, but people rarely talk about other things like, hey, you need to have contrast between characters and make sure that characters want a thing when they come into a scene, right? And that also, like, don't let the tension out of the scene. Build it up, right? I think it would be kind of nice to just play a game that just, like, has a little bit of advice of being like, hey, like, here's how to make your game funnier, right? Like, here's some tips on how to roleplay your characters where you'll have a funnier time.
Yeah, I do think, although there have been a number of comedy games, and they have even some funny games. I do think that there's more work that could be done in that. I think there could be even better comedy games that haven't yet been made.
Yeah, I'll definitely be interested to try out Triangle Agency at some point because that's pretty explicitly a comedy game, right? But I'm a little worried about...
It's weird.
Yeah, right? I mean, it's meant to be like an absurdist satirical take.
Yeah, definitely.
Right? On things
there's
like
a lot of black comedy
FCPs and Delta Green type games. And right, it's clearly like a much more comedic approach.
Sure. And like reading it is often quite funny, like the way it describes things.
Right. And often like in the rulebook comedy is not good. Right. Sometimes it works, right? But a lot of the time it falls pretty flat.
That's actually another like component sideline from all of this is because there's also like funny parts of the book. Like the book can be written, a rule book can be written in a way that's funny, or rules can even be funny sometimes. Like I feel like sometimes some of that humor is mostly funny if you're like a game designer. But I've seen jokes like actually in the Monty Python game, it uses a step die system where you move up, here's the D4 to D6, etc. But it actually intentionally goes up to like, okay, and here's the D12, and here's the D14, the D16, the D18. The game actually, if you back the Kickstarter, they actually made custom dice you would get to fill in those rolls.
Okay,
and
that's
the
really
part
fun.
of the joke is that the mechanics are almost not something you could usually execute, save for like using a digital roller. Oh, right, it went up to D30.
Yeah.
See, that's a mechanical joke.
Right? And mechanical jokes, right, are kind of interesting in that it has to be a joke that continues to be funny when it comes up over and over, right? That, like, it's sort of interesting that it's sort of like, oh, you kind of have to like create a very flexible framework for comedy when you're working with the mechanics, right? You can't just like write a joke and put it in a mechanic because that's like mechanics with joke names I almost never find funny, right? That very rarely is like calling a normal mechanic like big pointy stick stabby, right? Like a recipe for good comedy in the game, right? That you see that in some comedy games, right? It's more about like, oh, like the rulebook is kind of selling it straight that like here is the rules for how to play, right? And then you look at it and you're like, wait, what? A D14? where am I going to get a D14? Right? But they're still functional rules, right? And they're not trying to sort of like play it for yucks as much, even though they're clearly intentionally comedic.
Yeah. And another way would be that you can have mechanics where the mechanics are built in a way that that try to create certain outcomes. If anything, I more often see this in like certain mechanics that try to make things go badly and they're trying to be dark, or like if things work out this way, it cannot end well, it always goes badly. I mean, that can be funny though. You could use the similar sort of thing where like the outcome of this action will always be failure.
Yeah.
I wrote a game like that, which is kind of a comedy game essentially, where all actions failed.
That's interesting.
That was it's called Minus Spiral. It's up on Itch.
Yeah. I'll have to check it out, right?
Yeah, where it's just by default, we assume all actions fail and just you might get a silver lining.
Yeah, so how do you get to the failure, right? Mm-hmm. And how many failures in a row can you have before everything just fully falls apart?
Right.
Right? Yeah, going back to Monster Hearts and Apocalypse World games, the fact that there's a sex move is definitely funny. Right? The fact that there is like a mechanically relevant and important thing that happens when you have sex with another character, right? I think is like one of the best decisions for the comedy in those games, right? And that sometimes
I haven't heard it put that way before.
Yeah, because sometimes you do something bad to the other person too, right? Sometimes you like exert control over them or get strings or like, get them to make you a promise, or like it's kind of like this weird contrasty, like you're kind of playing off the fact that it is a gamey interaction to say that you have sex with someone in a game, right? And then it has a very like gamey outcome, right? And it's kind of like a little manipulative.
To be fair, there was a line in that I thought was funny. The Witch has a move where their move in that set is that they get to take like a personal object from
like a lock of hair. Or,
that they can now use magic on them,
including to curse them.
To curse them, but what the text says, like you get one of those tokens, they know about it, and it's cool.
Yeah,
that's how it's phrased. And I thought that very funny.
Which I think that is really funny, right? And that's a case of like the slightly more casual writing mixed in with the formal writing really kind of adds some emphasis, but it also doesn't like go super over the top zany, right? It just describes it in a slightly...
Well, it's also a functional rule.
Yeah. They know about it and it's cool.
Yeah, like because it's not saying that you like secretly stole it. It's just in the moment they let you have it. It's gonna say they just let you have it. Explain why.
Yeah, right. And that's also part of what I think makes horniness funny in role playing games, but also really hard. Is that almost all the time, right? Like if you're flirting with an NPC, what you're actually doing is turning to your friend running the game and flirting with them as a fake character.
Which is why I think a lot of people don't do it.
Yeah, because it feels weird. I've definitely, like, as a GM, I'm still, like, even though I'm pretty comfy with most things, I've played games where that's a big part of it, right? It's still always a little weird, right? Especially if you, like, play with family members, for example, right? I play with my sibling Jay, right? Who's a wonderful person to play with, super fun, right? But if they suddenly started flirting with an NPC, I'd be like, well, I guess we're rolling with this, but this is weird, right?
Yeah.
It's in some ways much easier when players are flirting with each other than with NPCs, but also kind of not. People tend to lean away from that a bit because it's more sustained. People do tend to lean towards flirting with NPCs, but then I think that's partially because there's like maybe more of a separation between the GM and the character. They're less identified with that NPC, right?
Yeah.
I don't know.
Or, only play RPGs with your polycool, I guess.
Always an option, a good option, right? Though even then, sometimes in the polycule, there's someone you might not be comfortable directly flirting with.
Sure,
right? So clearly, only triads can play RPGs with sex in them. Okay, I think we've explored the topic pretty well, right? I'm sure we'll have more thoughts in the future, but I think that's good for today's episode.
All right.
So yeah, I've been Red Rose.
And I'm Blue Rose.
This has been Rose Playing Games, and I hope you all have fun and have some good laughs.